Hello, innovators. I'm Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Trevor Ewen. He is an experienced software engineer, project manager, real estate investor, and you build full stack projects in clean energy, insurance, finance, and media. So thank you for joining me on the Polymath Polycast.
Thanks for having me, Dustin.
And so this is a show by PolyInnovators, so please say hello to the innovators in the audience.
Hello, innovators. Yeah, whatever you're doing, I think hopefully we'll have something for you in this talk.
Well, I think that each episode brings something new to the table, and so whether you're innovating or multidisciplinary or just curious about learning new things, there's always something in these episodes for you. Hello and welcome to the Polymath Polycast. So the way I like to break the ice is to have you share something about yourself that no one knows about you.
Share something that nobody knows. I guess this is an interesting one. I used to record music very often late at night, and I would record in the studio at Northwestern University at the radio station, WNUR, where I would just do late night sessions with tons of different bands. And one thing I did that I was really proud of and haven't really shared with a lot of people is a special weekend overnight session I did with one of my best friends, and he recorded 3 garage band songs that I really liked the production on, and we really never had a market for it, but it was just a great thing that I'd still be proud of showing people today.
Yeah, maybe you can find a way to market it or just share it out with the world too.
Yeah, I think he did some. We're rewinding pretty far here. He did some MySpace promotion for that one at the time, but because he didn't have a band at that moment, he was fiddling around and doing some really cool stuff. But considering the fact that I was recording a mix of professional and amateur musicians, it just surprised me that that was still one of the things to this day that I'm most proud of.
That's really awesome, and especially considering the time period too. I figured like the actual skill set was probably a higher skill ceiling at the time too, learning
Yes.
all the tools and all that stuff. So that's really impressive.
Yes, and I think it was indicative of the time was about to change, because that tool set that I used at that time just would be way less relevant now. Not only would the capital expenses be so high, but less and less people are using Pro Tools, for instance, and I'm completely fine with that. I think music production has been very democratized in a good way.
Do you make any music nowadays?
Not really. Part of the thing with me, and this is just the way I am, I guess, but I tend to want to be all in when I'm doing something, and music is such a deep well to go into that I'm either 1 or 0. I got to be pretty aggressively involved in it or not. There's a lot of people who can just pick up an instrument, play a couple times a week, and really get a lot of mental satisfaction and joy out of that. Frankly, I wish I had that characteristic. I just don't. The moment I start playing music, I have to then practice all the time and make more recordings, and I'm constantly thinking about new stuff to do, new variations, and then eventually forming bands. And in the worst cases, I'm forming multiple bands, which is then causing me to go even deeper into that well.
Well, and that's an interesting topic I'm sure we'll touch more on too, just the high idea of like hyper-focus versus diversification and focus. And there's also the idea of like cycles too. Like sometimes I'm in a cycle of learning, sometimes I'm in a cycle of creating, sometimes both if I'm really going at it too. And I'm wondering how you might be in that way too, like how your cycles might be as well.
Well, if we're using music as an example, I've tried to identify ways in which I could, at a different point in my life, get back to music, but because I know that where my dedication level is with having companies and having a family and just being at that stage in my life where time demands a lot of me, it's just been something that it's been nice to put on reserve. But I think I'd be very disheartened if I went the next 50 years without picking up instruments again. But once I do it, it's going to have to be a very intentional kind of phase that I take. And I think with other topics, it's a little different. I mean, we'll get to it as we go through the list, but say something like real estate is an example of something I do much more passively, and therefore I can spend 1 to 2 hours a week on something like that in a way that it just wouldn't be satisfying for me to do that with music, and it just is a different relationship I have with the two things.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and you mentioned a word there I find really fascinating is phase. And so I actually created PolyInnovator to be the foundation for all the future phases in my life, the future bubbles, if you will, too. And it's just interesting to think about, like, there is the macro, the phases, and then, like, the micro, like, what are you doing month to month and kind of stuff like that, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes there's moments where you say, I could do this for a little while, and there's a specific goal around it. The most common example, just going back to the music example to sit on it for a second, would be we had a lot of friends who liked our bands, when I had various run of bands about 10 to 12 years ago. And eventually, once all those people had big celebrations in their lives, specifically weddings, we would end up always having to play a couple songs for them. And that was the most fun part of the wedding, obviously, because it was, getting everybody back together and getting to play some tunes. And doing that would be getting back into the rehearsal groove and having, like you say, a phase, right? And that phase would be about a week, maybe, if we were involved in the bridal party, because we'd probably be there for the rehearsal or whatever the lead-up process was, and then we'd also have practice sessions right before.
Right. Well, and I love how we went kind of straight into the whole meat of things, too. That's the one thing about the show, is that it's free form, and when something interesting comes up like that, we can go straight into it. And we went through your history a little bit, but the first question here I have is, what was your mindset 5 years ago, and how have you changed since then? So still kind of that history kick.
Sure. I think one thing is I'm becoming maybe a little bit more conservative about what I can accomplish in the amount of time that I have, and trying to choose more wisely what things I focus on. 5 years ago, I would say I was really doing a lot of different things, and it always had my hands in different pies. Of course, that's what the show is all about, and I think there's a lot of value to that. We'll talk about it. But since then, learning how to say no is a bigger part of my life. Part of that is having kids changes a lot of your free time, of course. The other side of it was just looking back. Track record, I think, is good, but I always thought, I don't really hit most of the deadlines of things I want to do on the time I want to do them. So that means I probably need to give myself more of a timeline to just get them done for the most part. I'd say work-wise, the way I've changed is I was dabbling in the possibility of working for larger enterprises back then, and I did for a few years. Now I'm almost wholly uninterested in that. I'm much happier to be on my own, and I had a kind of interesting career arc where I was in a relatively small company, then I was entrepreneurial, then I was in a very large company, and now I'm back to entrepreneurial, and I don't think I'm going to go back the other way now. It's just nice to get to try out every kind of environment and then say, okay, I know why I like this one the most.
Right.
Everything has its challenges, everything has its trade-offs, but you could be confident thinking there's not really greener grass on the other side of the fence.
Yeah, because you got to try it already, too. And I've noticed a lot of multidisciplinary people being more entrepreneurial, too. Because when you have all these various interests, like, say you have a small phase of, I want to learn this skill to run my business better, whatever that may be. Maybe it's operations or HR or something like that. And you're like, I want to focus on this. In a corporate world, you may not have the freedom to do so. But if you're trying to make your own company better, you have that capacity as the leader, or at least the second in command to, and all the various different levels, depending on the structure, obviously, organization structure. But it's interesting to think about the ability of freedom of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think most people would tell you that there's, more freedom to entrepreneurship generally. I think that's a double-edged sword sometimes, because it's the freedom to imprison yourself, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs end up getting imprisoned by their business. But one of the things I've noticed is, in especially highly structured environments, which are important, there are kinds of entities that need to be very structured, right? The military is the idiomatic example of this. There has to be a chain of command, a hierarchy, because people have to know what to do when something goes wrong. But highly structured organizations do not really value too much of going outside your lane. And so that's a term that's used a lot as well. And, people even in the entrepreneurial space can be detrimental about how much they go outside their lane. I mean, you still have to choose things. You have to be intentional about the things you do. But it was always interesting to me, how my work in the corporate world and my real estate investment, those two things had never crossed each other. There was just no real fertile ground for them to work together. But back being in my own business now, some of the people I invest with are either investing with our company or they've become customers already. And so that idea of cultivating the exponential returns from different aspects of your network, different aspects of your personality, I think just opens up a lot more in an entrepreneurial domain.
Yeah, well, and it seems interesting, too, because between all those different types of businesses, you've also been able to experience a lot of different types of technologies and technological roles, And so between all your technological knowledge areas, what about programming do you find most fascinating then, given your experience?
Yeah, I think what I love about programming is the kind, and this is going to be an answer you probably don't hear that often, but it's really the kind of work that it enables, which from an intellectual exchange perspective is very powerful. I've been since I got into this, I was an early Linux open source kind of person, and I didn't really think that that would pay off that much. I was more interested in it just because it was very interesting to me at the time, the idea of all these people independently creating software and giving it out to other people. Turns out, with the way things went in cloud and much of the modern web development and mobile development trends, open source has really taken over. But I still love that way of working, and I think it's awesome. The fact that people around the world who I've never met, people like Dustin Miller, or the Dustin Miller of Belarus is developing some kind of library, some kind of module that I'm going to use in my project. It could even have a transformational effect on me. Somebody from not far from you, I just emailed him. I couldn't get in touch with him, but I'm sure he's busy. He developed a really excellent. It's a guy in St. Louis, and I'm blanking on the name, but I think that this tells you a bit about the models. Like there is that anonymity, but he developed this PDF library that literally just saved my behind recently in a project. I had no other way to deal with this issue, and here's this guy, not too much older or younger than us, who just built this library that was the best version of that I ever saw. And so I like that kind of collaboration. The fact that I can just reach out to him, I could make a pull request into his repos, I can use all his stuff. He could, in theory, work for me in the future. Just the way discovery and the way social interaction works in this field is just awesome.
Between like indie hackers and GitHub. It's funny, I just recently started using GitHub a lot more because I built my new website on Ghost. And since I had to do more coding, I wasn't very adept at coding. I've tried over 6 times in my life to learn basic programming, whether it was Python or HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And I know the basics of like web design when it comes to HTML, CSS, and tiny bit of JavaScript. But luckily, I didn't need to know that much for Ghost. But I remember going through and trying to find the best theme. And since everything's open source, you could just go through and look at everyone's themes. And they have like 2,000 on GitHub. And I went through every single one, literally all of them, just to see what features, which ones had what kind of designs, that kind of thing. And I managed to find one and take the bits and pieces that I liked from other ones and put it all together. And it's all because it was open source.
Yeah, yeah, and that method of development has just enabled so much. It's enabled a lot of people to learn. It's also enabled us to just bring down the cost of, developing and building new software in a way that it just wasn't in the bad old licensing days of Microsoft and Oracle. And what's also fascinating is to see those companies changing too, to be more in tune with the open source style. I mean, I was making a bet on this 15 years ago. I really was, but I didn't think it would turn into this, and it makes me wonder if I'm actually too cynical, because if this good of a framework can actually take the world by storm, then maybe there's other things that I think are a little small time right now that actually will be huge, wide, global phenomena very soon. I hope that's the case.
What about like blockchain or decentralized platforms, considering that they're more open and kind of same mindset?
Yeah, decentralization as a general proposition, I love. Big fan of it. I think it's going to be hard to figure out who the winners are, just like it was in the late 90s web era, where you had so many, pretty much so many open scams or pump and dump schemes and all those kind of things, versus the few companies, who many of which we still know today, who made it out of that and became pioneers in technology. I think it's going to be similar to one of the things about blockchain and crypto that can be a little tough, and I hope I don't get you any negative mail here, but because there's such a financialization to it, it encourages a lot of rapid speculation and adoption, and I often think a lot of snake oil types get into that market a lot quicker than they would in other spheres. But yeah, decentralized platforms as a general concept, and blockchain being a part of that, absolutely, I think it's going to be really important, particularly as security and certain kind of laws in certain national jurisdictions becomes a bigger problem. I don't know if you heard this week, the president of Belarus grounded an airplane just to get a journalist off there that had been critical of him in the past, and starting to think about, okay, what kind of networks, what kind of resources will journalists like that need to be communicating with each other outside of the eyes of government. And you could play the same thing forward in North Korea or any other kind of totalitarian state.
Well, it is interesting too, the potential, and given the cynicism when it comes to like the open source you mentioned before too. What do you think maybe the future of open source is going to be like, whether it's software or hardware? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's going to continue. I think you're going to see, I hope more and more, you're going to see more and more companies adopt it as an actual strategy push. I saw this a little bit when I was in banking, but it wasn't to a high level and part of it is because those organizations tend to be pretty conservative, and I'd say the lawyers kind of run the orgs in many cases, right? So they say, wait, we're going to make a bunch of software available for free. That's not a good idea, right? And so they clamp down on it. But I think it's critical for them, these big companies, as a recruiting tool and also just a strategy for getting their brand out there. I mean, you might be familiar, I'm sure some listeners are, with Twitter and the Bootstrap UI framework. Well, they released that years ago, and the whole idea was just the classic, well, we've generated this great UI standards library. Let's just release it. It's not like we're going to have to stop using it, and we prefer it if more things on the internet look like us. That was a really great idea, and I mean, we're now at a point where some, above 20% of sites out there are probably using those themes just to get things up and running, and that's just a powerful brand recognition. I think of that like the mid-century brand titans, a company like Coca-Cola. It's just almost like you cannot dissect that brand away from the time period. It's so intertwined with exactly what was happening. And I think the companies that take open source very seriously like that, they will get these broad cultural benefits that are hard to quantify. It's not just money. It's just the idea that, the ubiquity of that look and feel, or that style of doing this work, that style of programming.
Well, and I think too, building upon the shoulders of the giants before you too. Like when we have more of this open source and more of the companies like Twitter doing stuff like that, it pushes everything forward much faster too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think they correctly thought, there's a lot of applications out there that do not have custom design needs, so let's just give them a basic set of stuff that we like and looks good for us. And especially, I've seen it with our customers, particularly the ones where it's internal technology, so look and feel just really isn't that important. It's primarily helping them to do a job. Mm-hmm. Those toolkits have been incredibly powerful. Sometimes when you have a customer-facing application, you do want to do custom design because it's a differentiator, obviously. But with internal projects and all the stuff that would just otherwise waste a lot of time, it just helps you to move faster. Gives you more of a, it's like going to the hardware store. You don't chop down your own trees. You get lumber cut into certain dimensions and treated for you, and that way you can build stuff quickly.
Well, and it's funny because like as a customer, if I go to a website and it's not well made or well designed, I may actually make my business decision based off of that too. Like I went with my Polycast host purely because I respected the way they marketed themselves and created content and actually created their website and design, keeping it consistent, that kind of thing. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah. So speaking of technology and just overall your experience, you've overseen full stack teams in clean energy, finance, media, and what some similarities do you see across the board given your breadth?
Well, the truth of the matter is, this is kind of a joke that I make a lot when I'm, in the company of other developers. But we always build the same application, right? We read items from the database, and then we put them back in another form later, right? And you're going to do that a lot regardless of what industry you're in. The variability is going to come in terms of how the users are interacting with it, what some of your security requirements, product concerns are going to be like, and in another way, just how much fun or interest it is. I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that we have businesses that we work with that are dealing with a pretty complicated customer interface problem or internal operations problem. So one example we have a case study about this, which gives people an idea. Is they're an insurer, and in order to get an insurance contract going for a recently purchased automobile, you have to get a lot of data points, right? And it's not something that you want to just leave to chance with a spreadsheet. So much of the stuff is regulated by state laws, and there are certain requirements that need to happen. So, taking someone through a workflow like that is a, kind of like a micro example of a lot of what we do. The same thing when we've worked in solar power. The whole process is effectively just helping manage the complexity of doing work in solar power or any kind of clean energy. Same thing when we worked with a company that does landfill monitoring, right? There's just a lot of data that has to come out of a landfill. It's very unique and very bespoke to the situation. So I think I'm using the broad list of industries to obviously market the fact that we have worked across industries, but the secret there is that all the projects are relatively similar. Right? The one thing you do get a little bit of is some platform and domain expertise as it relates to a specific business. So one example I'll give is because I've started working with more people on the CFO and accounting side recently, I'm doing more work with accounting APIs, and that's going to give us more of an edge on those kind of projects.
Well, and it also makes me think of us, like people like us, when we are tackling new knowledge areas or learning a new skill or something like that. It's not like we're starting from scratch fully. For one, we already learned to become beginners over and over again by being so interested in putting the hands in different pies or cookie jars. So you have the skill of learning a new skill. But on top of that too, you come back from a background of experience. You have experience in this area that can be translated in some way into that new skill. This area, again. This area, again. And so like you said too, the app process or the process that you might be working on there, whatever you're building for that company, it's going to be similar to what you did before. Obviously, the nuances behind it are different, but the same structure of learning, or in this case, creating, is still the same.
Absolutely. And we obviously take lessons that come from each place. I think it's always, there's a trail of good experience, but also bad experience in every case. And then we say, okay, let's not make that mistake on the platform this time. And we are on one hand trying to be very operationally consistent. It's one of the things we like to do with our applications is build them all in a very similar way, and that just makes it easier for our developers and other people to get into these code bases. Say this isn't going to be something completely new every single time. But the flip side of that is, you want to do a postmortem after a project and say, what could we do better, right? And what can we improve into the next one? And eventually I've had a couple of these this year, unfortunately, because it's been a big year, but you'll have a larger shift where you say, okay, we are forever eliminating, using this library, this framework, because it's caused, X problems for us. And that can obviously be painful because when you first make that decision, you realize, wait, 80% of our applications are using this thing, and now we want to get rid of it. But as you move forward with that, you develop more rationale around why you wouldn't want to do it again. And that's the virtuous cycle with it that we keep learning.
Well, again, the whole idea of cycles and just learning from the last mistake, or even not mistakes, like successes too. And it's interesting that you were mentioning that. Let's also get the names out here too. You started two ventures, the Southport Technology Group and Southport Ventures. So how are those going for you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, that's the big piece of information for me this year, for sure. So Southport Technology Group is we're doing the projects that we spoke of, so the insurance and clean energy and those. We work with customers to build applications, and that's pretty much up and running at capacity right now. To build out capacity now, I'm going to need to bring on a few more project managers, which is all right, but I was a little surprised. Client development went better than I expected.
That's awesome.
So that's great. And moving along, I think the big thing we're trying to do is figure out what areas to focus on the most. We've gotten some really cool inbound projects. One I'd like to brag about a little bit. We're doing a project with a foundation in California called the Free Law Project, and they help make a lot of court documents available to lawyers and plaintiffs or defendants all over the country, just in an effort to make the legal process nationally just more open and transparent for people. Kind of going back onto that open source theme. And it's the same thing. I mean, the legal process for so many people is so hard to navigate. So they're taking advantages they can to make more of the data open to people for whether it's studying or to just help lawyers better represent plaintiffs or defendants that don't have a lot of money. It's kind of a cool little space to be in. And the biggest problem is you want to do everything and you can't do everything. So It's always just figuring out how we bring it down to size. Southport Ventures is long-term what we're very focused on, and that is a business that is acquiring other software companies. And so my partner, during the week, he will spend more of his week on that, whereas I'll spend a little bit more time on Southport Technology Group. but we are 50-50 on both. It's the way we've like to set up the organization. And that's a fascinating process because we're sourcing businesses, we're getting on phone calls with owners, and it's amazing what you find when you go out there. I mean, there are people who want to talk about selling their businesses, and they have these really cool, awesome, innovative businesses, and you can learn a lot just from talking to these folks. And obviously, we're looking to do a larger acquisition at some point this year or next. We're fine with the 2 to 3 year timeline if it takes that. But there's a lot of really cool little projects as well, and they could almost be a little distracting in some ways, but there's a lot of awesome stuff going on out there. Just people just like yourself,
just doing something
out there, building something,
Yeah.
whether it's a podcast or some kind of application or some kind of e-commerce site. They're building something cool.
Well, and it's funny that you mentioned that. The podcast is literally like a second thing for me. I've been working on my Omni content, which is a unique way of approaching content creation, and that's great. And in fact, I actually wanted to create a social media management tool, or based off of that, maybe even a content management system in general, based around this unique form of content creation and repurposing. But even more so than that, the first phase for PolyInnovator has been around this modular degree, which is a self-directed learning experience, and I wanted to create it into an application. And I thought that that's a new way of approaching education, just like you were saying there. Like people like me all over, I'll find people online with these different tools or different endeavors that are just sparking out new, fresh. It's just amazing, fascinating.
Well, and the quality of the online courses is blowing me away at some point. I mean, on one hand, you've got the MOOCs, Coursera's, Khan Academies, and a lot of the university courses that have just been made virtual. I mean, those are great, obviously, because it's really cool to say, hey, anyone can take the famous Princeton algorithms class, right? But I'm even more impressed by some of the stuff that people have targeted natively at the online format. So how much more, and I'm sure you're into this too, but how much more they make it super interactive and super purposefully an online class, so much so that you couldn't even do it as an in-person class. It'd have to be this kind of thing where you're able to sit on a computer, concentrate on it for a long time, and really do it that way. So, I'm very bullish on the space. We are not buying online courses because it's not our area really to focus on, but we know some other acquisitions folks who do actually target online courses, and they find really cool stuff.
Well, and what I find fascinating is that how do you know which one to take next? How do you know what order do you want to do these things in? You mentioned before, too, you can't do everything. And when I first made my own modular degree, I had over 450 courses, MOOCs on there, basically,
Wow.
and playlists and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's obviously not going to work, even if I did one per day, which is already excessive, because some of these courses are 30 hours long. Even if you go 2x speed, it's still way too much. It would still take over a year to get done. So I obviously cut it down, I trimmed it down, but knowing how to go about trimming it, knowing how to structure it into semesters or projects or however you feel is best, like maybe subject. And on top of that too, maybe not just MOOCs. Maybe there's also other things out there too, like articles, podcasts, videos, audiobooks, regular books, that kind of thing. Just all these different aspects behind learning. And I've seen a lot of people go out there when it comes to creating these tools. And there's a new tool called specialproject.io that takes this idea of a YouTube channel, but also a subscription service like Netflix, and combines them together. And it's a unique way of going about video content. That's awesome. And just like, there's all these different new tools like that.
Yeah, listen, I think it's excellent. And I think we're at a point now where the way I would like to onboard new employees is by doing something like that, by saying, here, we have a selected amount of material that we need you to just go through, and some of it's courses, but like you said, some of it's some podcasts and articles. That we've done the V1 of that with our company. I think I still want to develop it a little more to have more of a course component and a slightly more interactive component, but there is anyone who onboards with us, there is just here's all the stuff you've got to read for sure, here's all the stuff you've got to watch, and here's all the stuff you've got to listen to, right? And they're just It's what you'd expect. It's mostly just thought leaders in our business, both businesses, right? Depending on which side of it they're on, just saying, hey, here's the advantage of this approach. And then that gets them in the headspace of where we are, right? Which is, you're not going to know everything we know, obviously, because we've been at this for a little while, but I want you to get up to level 1 of how I think about these problems, so we're not actually, firing in different directions.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. So you have this passion for automation, and I love automation too, so I'm really curious to talk to you. What about automation do you really get you most excited, I guess?
Well, I think we're specifically ones to build it, right?
Hmm.
So just the fact that I think a lot of people look at it and say that's pretty high opportunity cost to do that. For me, it's just lower because I can build my own automation. So already that means I should do more things. I think it is worth always double checking the opportunity cost on it. There are times when you say to yourself, I could build a script, take 3 hours, or just doing this one time thing that I know I'm never going to have to do again will take an hour, right? So
Hmm.
maybe do that. One thing I did get in the habit of, though, which I really liked as a practice, especially when I was working in corporate environments, which in all honesty can be a bit more boring, is I would have a task that I didn't have to build a script for. I didn't have to automate it, but I just would. The challenge I set for myself was I will automate it. So whenever one of these tasks comes up, I will just create the script. And in one hand, it felt like somewhat wasteful to just have all these one-offs that you were really using for one single task, and then you're done, and you spent maybe hours on it. But it's a reflex thing. It's just
Hmm.
practice. And what I really liked is I developed a something that I've used a lot over the last few years, a pretty strong vocabulary for just rapid fire scripts and terminal programs that I use for all kinds of stuff. And it's been one of the foundational tools we've used for Southport Ventures, because that's allowed us then to quickly ramp up the sourcing side of the business, which is pulling down a lot of different companies so that we're able to go out and contact them and see if they've thought about selling.
Like some scrapers or something like that too, and whatnot.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's interesting.
Scrapers, APIs, there's a lot of different
Yeah.
ways we get information.
Well, and it's interesting too because I thought about doing that with my own website for various different reasons, and it's also just interesting to think about like content creation and stuff like that. I just a little kind of tangent here. Power Automate Desktop. Have you used that much?
No.
Okay, it's a Windows tool, kind of like Zapier in a way, where you can create your own automation without having. I mean, you probably just program a lot of things in a Python
Yeah.
script or something like that, but you can do something like that, but much quickly and more visually, in my case too, which will help through
Yeah.
Power Automate Desktop. And I thought that was really cool. It's like kind of Zapier for your Windows PC.
I recently did a Zapier implementation, and it was kind of accidental because typically, if someone's using Zapier, I usually tell them, "Hey, you don't have to use us. Like that's the reason to use Zapier, so you don't have to pay us." But it turns out they needed some custom JavaScript in the middle of the Zapier script, so they needed someone to come in and intervene there. I got to say, I was impressed with the tool. I think I love where a lot of these tools are going, and I think it's just very empowering for the people who get to use it. So I love stuff like that.
I love them too. I've actually been very frustrated with Zapier, but I'm also the kind of guy that created a 20-step Zap in
Okay.
Zapier. And when it didn't work, I fixed it, and then it didn't work again. I fixed it. Constant, like, the cycle is going back and fixing it, fixing it, and fixing it. And that was really annoying. But I realized it was partially just because it was too big. It was too broad for that function of how that tool works. But I thought it
Yeah,
was
I think
interesting.
3 to 5 steps is probably a better sweet spot. So.
Yeah. Well, I also try to use the beta feature of like delaying stuff and stuff like that. But it was interesting. It was very interesting to experiment with and seeing it visually too. But maybe I could do it with like Python or do it with a tool that I can make myself or something like that.
Yeah, but I think getting to it, you still have to go through all that debugging with the code. I think one advantage with the code is you can eventually write yourself out of it, right? You can always solve the problem given enough hours, but you'd be amazed the amount of hours some of these problems take. So just be careful. You can spend a whole life on Python
Well,
scripts.
speaking, well, kind of going beyond just scripts, then what do you think of like content creation automation or Jarvis like assistants, or maybe even something else that I can't even think of?
I'm pretty much in favor of anything that helps people do the things they want to do better, with the caveat, and I can mention a book I've been reading lately, which is called Digital Minimalism. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Yes.
It's by a guy named Cal Newport, who I really like. He talks a lot about how you should try and get all the tools in your toolkit that really help you to do the things you want and not be a casual user of things. And that made me think a bit more about what kind of things am I allowing to be in my space, but I'm not really getting good ROI out of them, right? And it could be just news feeds or even newsletters I have coming into my email. Starting to think about what aspects of your digital life are producing the most value. And so I guess that's where I'd put a high level of value on focus and concentration, for instance. So I think anything that would help me to do that, that would genuinely help me to do that, I'd be in favor of, and I'd probably spend money on it, and I'd want whatever kind of good automation people had provided for that. But maybe something that probably isn't as useful to me on a day-to-day basis, but I could just kind of let happen in the background, maybe say news apps and things like that, which I don't really need during the day. I'm better to find other ways to do those things and then just not worry about it and get less of that stuff in my space so I do have a focus. I don't know if that's a good answer to your question. But.
Well, actually, I think it's really great. In fact, there was a few different things I wanted to spin it off of there. It made me think of, too, of like getting like an RSS aggregator instead of going to a news website. Like if I went to Kotaku, instead of seeing the Kotaku webpage, just get the links, because all I care about is the headlines usually. Then I can go in there and see whatever topic I want to learn more about. But like finding a way to consolidate. Instead of going to 12 different sites, you can just go to aggregator and make it more simple. Or information architecture was the other thing I was thinking about when you're talking about minimalism. A lot of people don't realize how you structure your Windows PC, for example, or even Mac or Linux. How you structure the file structure in there makes a big difference in how you want to organize your photos or files and that kind of thing. And the last one was Notion, Notion.so. Have you used the tool much?
No, although I did review it a bit for our wiki option for my company, and we didn't end up going with it, but it is something I might still look into in the future.
I use it. Well, this past month I've been really unproductive compared to my last whole year, I guess you could say. But basically, before this past month, I had been using it daily for everything, whether it's personal or professional. And I definitely simplified it. Like you said, minimalism. It's like taking things down and breaking it up to a more easy access kind of reach and making sure it's minimal in that kind of way. I had made sure I made it overly complicated at one point, but I simplified it much more and whatnot. But like even right now, I'm looking at it for the notes for you. So the one thing I loved about it is how it consolidated tools for me. So I use Google Sheets or Airtable or documents, and then all these other things. Now it has an API too, which is exponentially more potential there. But just the fact that I had to use Google Sheets and Google Docs, two separate tools for this one function of like creating scripts, for example, or doing notes for a guest on the show, was frustrating having to go to a separate tool. With Notion, each line of the database is its own document, and that made a world of difference for me.
Yeah, I think tool consolidation is a huge win, and people will even use, I think Notion's a very good tool, so this isn't a problem there, but people even use a tool that's not as good if they just get the benefits of consolidation. One of the good examples of that right now in the market is Microsoft Teams, which a lot of people think is an inferior product to Slack, but because it has such good integration with the Microsoft platform for people who are already on that, they're just, I don't really need to use Slack. I'll just use Teams, right? And I'm not making a product endorsement necessarily, but I do think that shows how important consolidation is there, and something I try to do as well.
Well, consolidation, but also like you said, integration and just simplify for use of the user. And it made me think, what is the word? Dang it, I just had it on the tip of my tongue. But I was always a power user. Like when I use a new tool, I think you understand, I just go all into it and try to learn it, and I try to get like the deepest reaches of that tool. But it made me think too, like, is there some kind of tool or thing I'm using in life that I'm only taking a casual approach to? I'm only using it in a casual way. And it just makes me think, like, what am I doing that I'm not thinking about that I'm doing?
Yep. And I think digital minimalism would help you look at some of those items. Obviously in your digital life, there may be other things in other parts of your life that you're also taking a very casual approach to.
Yeah.
Like I said, I changed my news habits a bit to say, how can I read? Because I do like reading long form when I have time, but how can I spend more or less 2 to 3 focused hours on the weekend reading long form, which is the idea, instead of having it distract me during the day.
Yeah.
Even though it is a nice break. But,
right. Well, and we do have to take breaks too. I guess the one thing about overworking I've thought about as well. Minimalism has always been a big part of my life. If you see my apartment, it's one of those things where I don't have very much. I have quality of stuff, but I don't have very much. And it's one of those things that technology has been a big part of that. And speaking of something you're passionate about is real estate. Why are you so passionate about that topic, and what brings you so happy?
Yeah, I think using the word passion might be overdoing it a bit. I think I was always primarily interested in it for financial reasons initially when I started, and passive income is a great thing. I mean, anyone who's tried it will tell you it's a good thing to do. And the U.S. has a very odd housing market. We really are a global outlier. A lot of people don't understand this, that the U.S. makes homeownership a lot easier. And then so from an investor standpoint, there's just a lot of wind in your sails if you do real estate investment. I also had the problem of being in New York City in 2011, which is when I moved to New York. It's a really, really expensive cost of living. And so, my wife and I, shortly after we got married, we just said, I don't know if it makes a lot of sense to spend $800,000 on a one-bedroom apartment here, right? I mean, not that we even had that money to begin with. We would have taken out a mortgage, obviously, but we said, what can we do in other parts of the country? What can we do somewhere else? And slowly started to educate ourselves and learn a bit more about smaller housing markets that were actually really good for income, but also had just better what we in real estate investing call rent to value ratios, which meant that the rent relative to the value of the building was just higher as a ratio. And that's really good because it allows you to cover your mortgage, the taxes, put a little money in your pocket. So we started buying homes in Tennessee, and then we eventually, as you move up the ladder, you want some of the benefits from scale. So we partnered with multifamily operators to buy buildings then in Kentucky and North Carolina, and also one in New Jersey as well.
That's cool. And it also makes me think of just, too, how the scale of prices throughout the country. Like, obviously, San Francisco and New York can be super expensive, but I live in Missouri, and so rent prices here, on average, are like $750 a month, which, compared to a lot of places, is like half of what you usually pay, if not.
Yeah, I mean, Missouri has definitely hit the radar for a lot of our friends and colleagues as an investable market. Kansas City was very popular for a long time as an option to go to, kind of like an alternative to Tennessee. But yeah, I think that price difference in the U.S. it's actually narrowed, believe it or not, in part because while San Francisco and New York are still ridiculously expensive, a lot of other places have also crept up. We've seen that go on in Tennessee in the last few years. But certainly post-crisis, 2010, 2011, the gap was super wide. I mean, single-family homes in medium-sized cities in the middle of the country would sell for $50,000 or $60,000, and then meanwhile the one-bedroom apartment in New York is selling for $600,000, right? So that kind of price disparity, it makes sense that there is a price disparity between New York and the center of the country, but that is too extreme. 10x is a lot. So we came to it with the viewpoint, which I think it's been shown to be correct now based on what the valuations are today, but that those properties are probably undervalued, and the ones in New York are probably overvalued too. So let's go the opposite direction, which wasn't a really popular opinion.
Well, probably the wise one, though.
Yeah, I mean, once COVID hit, we looked very prescient because all of a sudden people wanted more space. We saw all those markets, including North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky, just get really, really pricey. And if you already own property there, you can capitalize on that. We actually sold one home during 2020.
That's awesome, especially considering everyone else is like probably suffering or maybe losing money, and you actually managed to make money.
Yeah, and we sold it to, it's not like we sold it to someone who was also in a bad strait. I mean, we sold it to, I think it was just another investor down the line, right? But he was still willing to pay that higher price for it, and we were able to wash our hands of it. So,
yeah, that's awesome. Something I find interesting is the placement of hobbies in the life of a multidisciplinary person. And you had mentioned to me before that they're more of an extension of your work rather than escapism, if you will. Having a quote here, actually, even though hobbies are an antithesis of what you do, they get away from what you're doing. And so what do you mean by that, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I was trying to think about it more as you and I did the initial get to know you and questions, and I already said it earlier, but I just want to compliment you. You're very good at prep. Anyone who's thinking of coming on the show should know that Dustin will definitely prepare very well for it.
Thank you.
And one of the things I was thinking about, it was actually because I've been reading that book this month while I've been down in Texas, but in Digital Minimalism, he talks about, what are the ways you would fill time if you're not just staring at a screen. In my line of work, you pretty much do all your work on a screen, other than the times that I'm meeting with customers, I'm always doing that. So I do think when I'm not on the screen, I am trying to get away from it. And so I'm trying to be outdoors more. I definitely like to, while I'm not playing a lot of music these days, I still love to see music as much as possible. And lately I've been also in regards to trying to find my kids more things to do outside as well. We've just been trying to do projects and build more just cool things. So one of the big ones we've got going this summer, which I'm really excited about, is we just rototilled the entire backyard, which where we live, backyards are not huge, but we still rototilled the whole thing. It was kind of empty before this. And we're going to plant like a pretty nice, well-curated garden. And I think that's going to be our Saturday morning activity for pretty much the entire summer, right?
That's
So
cool.
we'll develop a good routine around it. Wake up, probably either make or get some breakfast, head to Home Depot, pick out what plants we want to plant that day, and then we're trying to get it to a point where it is a small space. So there's the disadvantage of that is you don't have a ton of space, but the advantage is you also don't need to fill it with a ton of stuff. So, you could probably do it in the summer and make it look real nice and make it a bit of a backyard oasis for us.
Right. Well, you get to have a little bit more choice too, and since it is more minimal as well, you also have that freedom of just not having to have too many choices, I guess.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And
Yeah.
this show often goes after the diversity of lifelong experience, and they see how they all come together. So I ask you, how do you live your multidisciplinary life?
Well, I think there are advantages on either side of this. I know a lot of people in my life who are so singularly focused that they really go deep on something and it's important. But I guess I just don't look at that as the best opportunity set for someone like me, right? What I see is if I'm able to connect these pieces together, I might get something more or different out of it. Mm-hmm. And you have access to something totally different. And there is a concept that one of my professors at business school would talk about in regards to networking. And there's this idea called loose networks or tight networks. And don't worry, I'll resolve this to the multidisciplinary side in a second. But so a tight network is a group of people, let's say 6 to 10 people, where everybody has multiple relationships with every other person in the group. So some kind of athletic team would be a good example of that, or a really close implementation group, maybe the cast on a film set, who are all relatively equal status of actors, for instance. So execution groups are really tight-knit, obviously, and they're very good for getting something done, right? The fact that people know all this stuff about one another helps them to move quickly and make decisions. There's another kind of network, and it's much looser, and it's called an opportunity network. And it means that a lot of disconnected nodes along the network. And this is people that we're talking about in this particular case, right? So I happen to know Dustin Miller right now. I also happen to know, a lot of people who work in the New York technology industry. I also happen to know people who invest in real estate in North Carolina. I also happen to know people who run, oil and gas companies in Canada or the UK, right? So that's a much looser network. And when I took all the surveys to figure out what my network was, I very clearly had an opportunity network in terms of the amount of people I had around me. So I wanted to reapply that thinking back to, okay, so then how does this work with multiple skill sets or multiple pursuits in life? And it's a very similar concept, right? The execution style personality just says, I'm doubling down on this. A good example would be someone, think of if you know someone who's a physician, right? They've probably been in execution mode for 20 years because it requires so much study to get to that point, right?
Right.
And conversely, people who say put together deals or put together complicated structures, sometimes people who produce movies, for instance, have to be way more opportunity oriented, right? Because they're always looking around for something to drop into their lap and do something with it. And so having that mix of skills is just useful. The music conversation is a great one. I make no money doing anything with music right now, but it has been an incredible touchstone for building relationships with people where I didn't think that would be the touchstone that would build a relationship. And
being yourself too, like if that's part of you as who you are and that's what you enjoy, you don't necessarily have to make money off of it. If you make some money somewhere else, especially passively too, you can do what you pursue as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I want to get to a point where less of the things I do are about money making endeavors. I mean, really, that is the goal. I think there's been some shock in my generation coming out of the Great Recession. I really think at that time, and it's so different than now, but 2008, 2009, there was a lot of just concern about how things were just constantly going to get worse, and there was really no way to earn an interest rate or a normal yield. Housing was really expensive in most of the places that myself or my friends were living. So I do think we lulled ourselves into a work all the time kind of approach to life, but I don't really want to be there. I want to be working on a very highly efficient, highly effective set of businesses, and then spend the rest of my time learning and doing other fun stuff that I'd rather do.
I love that. And one thing I was going to mention too with that more looser network is it made me think that you're more of a super connector. Is a term that I came across in one of my first interviews.
People have said that to me before. I mean, you probably shouldn't label yourself a super connector. You should wait for someone else to tell you.
There you
But
go.
I think that's true. I mean, people who know me know I'm very intentional about making introductions across groups, and some of them, go nowhere as they often can. But I'm always quick to think about that other person I know who they might want
Yeah.
to meet.
Well, and that's one thing I love about this show too. It's like you're my 95th interview, and I've done also 50 interviews for me being on other people's shows, all since last May. And so all this networking that's happening now, I have a very loose network. Some more closer than others. Some people we stopped talking since the interview, or some people we've talked every month since then. And it's just one of those things where it is interesting how there was some connections where I was able to say, hey, I had this guest. You'll really like meeting this person. You should meet. You guys should talk. You guys definitely should talk. And it's just amazing how you can bring people together and make progress in their lives, too.
Yeah, it's why I love this format. I do better in a long format type of situation.
Awesome.
I assessed some of my sales and inbound business development efforts, and I'd always had this thought that, okay, I've got a lot of good relationships, and that's where a lot of our inbound development comes from, but I got to get better at cold marketing. I got to get better at cold outreach, right? The only thing is, every year when I look back, the only business I actually ever close are people I've actually spent some time with, right? More than an hour, and they're not going to just respond to an email. So I actually turned down the cold outreach, pretty much said I'm going to stop doing that for now, and say, what are the mediums and the formats I could do to build much more long-form relationships? And I mean, one of the big ones is just making sure to stay in touch with the people in my network who are actually my friends and I value. But podcast was another good example. It was the one long-form form of media where I felt like I could actually talk to someone and they would know a good deal about me.
Yeah. Well, and on top of that too, I also want to give people the opportunity to share their work. Like I made sure you got the name of their company on here. We're going to talk about where people can find you at the end and whatnot too, and having links. Like I always make sure that I have tons of links for people on the show, and that way, like, yes, we're having a conversation, we're building a connection. You and I might take this somewhere in the future, but on top of that too, you at least get an opportunity to share your work and share your projects that you're going on right now too, and like
absolutely,
yeah.
Yeah, and I want, I want your guest or other, not your guest, well, maybe your guest too, but certainly your listeners or other listeners to take interest in this and say, oh, I never realized there was so many environmental service and solar power companies who were looking for software development. That's an interesting thing. That's an interesting piece of information that someone could make a career out of.
For sure. And it's interesting too because we've talked a lot about the various aspects of your life, but there's these underlying threads I've noticed about like a polymathic mindset and how do you structure the habits in a polymathic life, that kind of thing. So something I ask all my guests is, what is a polymath to you?
Well, I think I'd go with a looser definition maybe than some people have, but it to me it is someone who can speak with depth to multiple topics and then at least give. I think everyone's always going to have something that they are truly deeper on. The old 10,000 hours concept, which I think was popularized by Gladwell. But the idea that once you spend 10,000 hours on something, you have what we would deem expertise in society. But one of the things I notice from people who are polymathic, and I'll claim myself as one for now, and we'll decide what other people think, is you'll get the comment a lot, wow, how do you know all this about this topic, right? And what they had done is mentally pigeonholed you and presumed you had this narrow focus, right? So if someone hears me talk about technology for a while, they just say, well, yeah, it's on his resume. That's what he does. But sometimes when I get into talking about public policy, the best thing is when you talk to someone from another country and you know a lot about their own country. That they always love that, and it's very honoring to them. Another one I got into too was finance, because I knew a good amount about banking and finance. Part of that was working in the industry, but a lot of people work in that industry for 30 years and never really want to take anything out of it. I said, I want to know a bit more about what's going on here, and that eventually lended itself to our real estate investment, and eventually Nicholas and I setting up Southport Ventures. So those things fed into each other, and there can be diversions, which are probably not as useful or as productive. I probably know way more than I need to about weird mid-'80s music trivia. That doesn't come up that much, but that's okay, right? I think that's part of the cost of doing it, and I still enjoyed much more the fact that we had 2 dinner guests last night, and we were able to just talk about very random, wide-ranging topics and get into some good depth with it as well.
Well, it's interesting too because I kind of see polymathy as a scale too. You have the jack of all trades, generalist, you have specialist over here, and polymaths and Renaissance people, and all these different terms. Generalist is like I said there, and it's like where do you find yourself on that spectrum? That's what you could identify with. And there's some people who see maybe even superconductor, polymath, these terms as almost egotistical, but in actuality, it's more of a descriptor. Sometimes by other people of you, but I think that too, if I want to call myself a polymath or polymathic person, I'm not doing it out of ego. I'm doing it as a way to explain who I am to other people, and if you will.
Yeah, and I think you should probably rarely, prescribe your own descriptor. I think it's the old, if you want to know what to do for a living, ask your friends what you're good at, and then you'll find out what to do. So I think that's it. That's where the egotism could come in. I think if someone just went around saying that they're a polymath, maybe it'd be harder to believe, but if they waited for other people to see and notice that and tell them about it, then I think it's a label you can take on. It's kind of earned like that, I suppose. Is my guess.
And I often go when I talk about myself, I say an aspiring polymath because I think that's more apt. And it's one of those things too where you mentioned the 10,000 hour rule, and Gladwell actually took a step back from that because of David Epstein's book Range, where he talks about people who are generalists and how it's throughout history, generalists have been here and doing our lives and that kind of thing. That's a whole other tangent there. But he mentions how, like, sometimes with generalists, especially with that trans-contextual thinking, it may not take 10,000. It could take 8,000. Maybe if you're taking a long time with deliberate practice, too. Without deliberate practice, you take 12,000 hours. It's very more fluctuating. And with a super deep practice, you can do it quicker. And Gladwell actually changed his opinion on it because of that discussion. It's just interesting how a lot of polymathic people can actually pursue things much more quickly as well.
Well, and I didn't read the Epstein book, and I didn't know that, but I have heard some of the good feelings coming back to generalists that have come out of his work, and I tend to agree. It's weird, right? So in my career, for instance, hard skills were obviously what I needed to have early on in my career. Nobody was paying me to think about anything else except for programming and software development.
Right.
But as I went on, an ability I'd had since college, but hadn't really thought much about, my ability to write had become extremely useful. Just to a level where it really is my differentiator in the programming world, right? And it's just strange because I wouldn't have suspected that at 22, but you just change a bit as you go with those things. So that's where I felt like the generalism came in for me, and writing and communication skills, I guess more broadly, are kind of like a piece of that for me.
For sure. It makes me think too, like, you do have that kind of one pillar at first too. Like, one thing that David actually talks about in his book is that sometimes it's more like a funnel. You kind of start out like a jack of all trades, nice and wide, hands out all different cookie jars, and eventually you funnel down into one that you're really good at, and you'll find what you really enjoy. But eventually after that, you're going to get bored with that. You're going to want to spread out. You may want to pivot to another area. So it starts out wide, comes in small, goes back out wide. And who knows how long that funnel could be. That could be your entire life. That could be every decade or something like that too, which is interesting to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's weird to think, it's one thing to think I could do very similar things for 20 years, but to say I could do very similar things for 50 years feels unlikely to me.
Yeah, exactly. We are not like too simple of means. Like, even people who work for the same company for 50 years, 60 years, they're doing different roles in that company, and they become polymathic throughout those roles throughout their life. And that's one thing I tried to share with people as well. You mentioned to me before, actually, that you've been accused and praised of being a polymath for many years, and always had your toes in a couple things at once. So how does that make you feel?
Well, I mean, it's still remembered very well from my first professional job. I don't know, it's debatable. I had a sort of professional job before then, but I'll say it was a family friend who hired me, and it was his small firm, so I didn't really think I was out there interviewing quite as much. And this was a person who was eventually a mentor to me, awesome guy who hired me at this company. But he did tell me after the interview, he said, we went with you, but we're just a little concerned you're spread very thin, right? You seem to be doing a lot, and we need you to be a bit more focused. And I think that is a typical critique that a junior employee will get, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I took it to heart, right? And part of it is because, if you get that kind of feedback from someone you don't respect, it's in one ear and out the other. But I had a lot of respect for Steve was his name, and He was a mentor of mine at the time, and so I wanted to do better about it and start to think, what gives people that impression, right? So there's got to be a good side and a bad side to this. So the kind of person who's just kind of scattered, and they're only like an inch deep, a mile wide. They've got a lot of things going on, but in no specific way that's really making forward momentum. And you would feel a little discombobulated by that, right? Versus someone who you think, wow, they are truly, as you would say, polymathic, or they are a good generalist. They know what they're doing in this general way. And so I think what I took from that, and it still just rings true in my head, is and it goes back to that we were talking about when we were talking about the Cal Newport book, Digital Minimalism. Am I doing things that are actually a good increase in benefit to me? Are they providing good ROI to me? And am I getting the necessary depth out of this I want, or am I just looking like someone who's kind of flaky and does whatever?
Well, and it's interesting too because I've gotten that feedback in the past of someone saying I'm a little too scattered, if you will, and it's not necessarily scattered in the sense of how much focus I'm doing, but scattered in how much I'm presenting myself in those areas. I thought about too, because like how you present yourself, how you brand yourself too, I think is very key. A lot of people who know me in these business spaces don't even have an idea that I've taught swimming for nearly a decade now. Probably like 9 years essentially, and
Oh, wow.
I can teach even Michael Phelps something new, I would argue, and it's just one of those things where I would say I'm deeply knowledgeable in that. And same thing goes with fitness. I teach fitness classes and personal training and stuff like that. That's my other world that I'm in. But like you said, people pigeonhole you. So everyone I see at the gym always thinks that I'm just exercise. They don't realize I create tons of content online. People who see me online don't maybe realize that I'm an avid gamer on top of that too. And same thing for you too, with all these different areas of music production, technology, allowing yourself to also be gardening and throughout the summer, that kind of thing. People may not know these aspects, and I wonder, how do we need to present ourselves as journalists, especially since people think we have a lack of focus or scatterbrained? What is the key then to presenting yourself, say, improving? Like, hey, I do actually know this knowledge. Maybe not a piece of paper from a prestigious university level per se, but I know it better than the average person. And that's what kind of I'm wondered about too.
Yeah, I think it depends on the risk of it, right? So if we're talking about a business development situation where you could land or not get a client based on this, right? I do think you have to show a level of expertise that will give them that confidence. And so if I'm going to, talk about the specific application a customer wants to build, then I probably shouldn't be talking about single family homes that much, unless they, really want to for some other reason. That said, I do think you can look at stuff that compounds and gives people more confidence in your abilities, right? So it's one thing to have, and I think you and I probably are both open to the idea that despite how unrelated two topics seem, there's probably still something there to relate them. But it's probably good to start thinking about what kind of topics compound and give you that benefit in conversation with people, right? So if I'm talking with people on the acquisition side of our business, then exposing that I've done real estate investment is helpful,
Right.
because it just gives them a level of confidence. Oh, you've looked at term sheets. You know what it's like to close a larger investment that involves debt and a number of other aspects of it, the transaction. Meanwhile, if I'm talking with a services customer or something like that, I just don't think it's something I would emphasize as much. And so it's knowing your audience a little bit, being okay with that, and then figuring out to what level you're going to brand yourself to. You can get yourself in trouble, right? That's why I say I want to let people know exactly what kind of real estate investor I am, so they don't ask me to do a roof replacement, right? I want to say I'm a passive real estate investor, so I can tell you everything about what that entails. But if you're looking to replace the copper pipes in your wall, then you might want to ask somebody else.
Right. Well, and contextualizing per person, code switching, if you will, too. So you had mentioned to me before in our last chat about the bubbles of life, if you will, areas of focus on, we kind of touched on too early today, endeavors like project or family, like you mentioned too, like the next bubble for you might be that garden in your backyard. So what bubbles are taking space in your life now?
Well, I think right now I'm almost entirely work family focused, and part of it's because this probably requires a little bit of background on my family. So I have 3 adopted kids, and we actually just adopted. So there's a lot of transitions going on. And as a result, that's a huge point of focus, because it's just a different process, right? They're not infants. So I'm learning more about them. They're learning more about me. And that just takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of getting to know each other. So I think that's where I've reserved a lot of my extra time. I finished up my master's degree, and having businesses, and then that is that takes a lot of my focus. But it's okay because in some ways I'll be able to either use them to help accomplish some of the goals I want, or live vicariously through some of the things they're doing. And it's a good phase for that, right? Because they need maybe some help or instruction with some things. The gardening was a good example of something we're all going to do together, because I'm trying to find more and more ways to get my kids outside. And that's just a really good one because it teaches them something. It's relatively fun. I don't think gardening's that bad relative to other chores and things you could do. And it gives us a chance to spend time together and to do something really nice for their mom. So
Yeah.
that's an example of the kind of thing I want to do more of with them. But there's gonna be a lot of other topics that are there that I'm not even quite sure of yet, right? I'll probably, my daughter really wants to do gymnastics in the fall, for instance. So I'll probably get more and more knowledgeable about gymnastics and figure out what that exactly encompasses. I don't really know what it. I will be not an obsessive kind of parent, because I think that can be kind of annoying, but I'll be knowledgeable to the level that I need to be to help her get to the next stage she's at. And I think that's going to be a lot of the things that take up my headspace. And then once that's done, go back to doing other things that I'm more interested in.
Yeah. Well, at this point, you have the whole new change in your life, that this is your big bubble that you're focusing on there. And I had a lot of swim lessons over the years that did gymnastics as well. And it is interesting how much it takes a part of their life, and they're really focused on it. And as a calisthenics more preferred exercise person myself, I know that the body weight stuff you can do can be very profound in how it evolves the body, especially as you're growing up too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just in general right now, I mean, with kids, the big battle is screen time. I think you and I probably spend a fair amount of time on screens, but we're mostly doing productive stuff, I guess. But it's tough. I want to give them more of the value and the benefit of going out and doing these things. I mean, I started exercising years ago, probably around 2004 or so, and I've been able to keep up that habit as well, which is good. Not as often as I'd like. And COVID obviously was really bad for heading to the gym.
Well, let me touch on that. First off, Trevor's calling me out here, guys. Like, I'm saying, no, I'm just kidding. But no, it's one of those things too where even as a personal trainer, like my habits went out the window when COVID hit. My gym closed, and my systems revolved around me working. Like I worked out when I had to go teach a shift, and then leave, and I just go upstairs and go work out. And so my habits revolved around my work. And when I stopped doing one or both, it basically went out the window, and I had to take a couple weeks off or to kind of slow back into things. And even now, I'm not where I was a year ago. I'm a bit stronger in some ways, but I'm also a bit heftier than I was. Not in a good way, even too. And like, if that, what my point is that like, if a personal trainer, someone who's like literally whole day life is around exercise, is having that much issue, it puts in perspective to people who are more on an average going basis, or even in your case that are probably more than average. It's one of those things where it takes time to get back into things, and give yourself a little bit of leeway with that.
Right. And you have to innovate it too. I mean, COVID was obviously very different depending on where you were in the country and all, but we weren't able to get back into gyms till, what month was it? I think February of this year, where I live. And so I had just, for a full year, I'd innovated pretty much, okay, what in my neighborhood can I use for outdoor exercise, right? And I realized, okay, well, that bar looks kind of like a pull-up bar, and, I can hang the rings up over there, and okay, I can, run this path, and then I'll be able to get to that area to do some kind of strength training as well. But it changed up a lot. It did make me appreciate the possibility of doing my workouts outdoors more than I had prior to that. Part of it was living in New York City, but I've been a strict kind of gym goer for a long time, just because there really isn't many places outdoors you can go. But once it hit, I had to innovate a little bit more. So, and
a couple points there is that I love more calisthenic workouts, which you can basically do anywhere, like push-ups. And it's just one of those things where that you can do everywhere. But also going to the gym puts you in the right mindset. You have that habit.
That's it. It's all about mindset and the place being the right place to do it. Yeah, absolutely. There were times when I go to the gym and I think, wait a minute, I didn't even use a single weight or a single machine, right? But it's being in the place. And it is the treats you get out of it too. I mean, I would always like, my gym had good shower pressure, right? So I'd just like getting a shower afterward, right? That would always give me, that kind of extra boost that was a small excuse to go. And
you mentioned a little bit while ago about graduating from school. So you recently graduated and finished business school. So how was that experience?
It was really good. The business school discussion is probably one that could take up a whole 2 hours. I'll say this: so I went to just so people are aware, because there's a lot of different programs out there. So I did a executive MBA program, which is targeted more at mid-career professionals, people who've usually got a decade plus of experience in their work and want to then get to a next level. And it's a joint program between Columbia Business School and London Business School, and we actually go to both, which is really cool. And you actually go in person to both. So that was great. It was a lot of travel. It was a lot of fun. I loved our cohort. Our classmates were great. The quality of the education was really high. I will say the role of the MBA in terms of what it means in the job market, I think, has changed a lot. And if you ever have any guests considering it, it's certainly something they can email me about, because I like talking about this topic with people. But it used to be a ladder, probably 40 years ago. An MBA was a ladder right into a corporate management chain. And there are still those opportunities. You think about companies like McKinsey or BCP, or not BCP, BCG. They're hiring a lot of MBAs, straight out of the top programs and pushing them right through their management chain. But that's rarer these days. More and more companies I'm seeing are just eschewing that altogether. They're trying to find subject matter experts, functional specialists. So they're going for some more of these smaller certifications like finance degrees or something like that. So the MBAs have, in response to that, I think they've become a lot more entrepreneurial. And there's good and bad aspects about that. But, the vast majority of our class was leaving to go start things. And then on top of that, the people who didn't even think they would be doing that, like people who had really stable jobs, you thought they were the more maybe conservative side of the spectrum in terms of stability. Even they're considering launching firms, because I just think it's where the activity is at right now. So it used to be this kind of idea, this is a long way of saying that the MBA would kind of pay for itself in 10 years because you'd get all these salary bumps. It's harder to measure that now, because if you're starting your own business, then you don't really know, like, was it me, or was it the salary, or was it the MBA? It's harder to figure out what is actually causing your success. But I will say the academia is very good and the network is incredible, and I'm just really glad to have met all these people.
Well, you chose two different schools too. I would consider to be very good choices. I actually looked at a lot of MBAs over the years. Business has always been a big part of my life, and I love it. And you said it could take like 2 hours to talk about this. I will do future sequel series of interviews down the line too, like a round 2 podcast, and so I can definitely have you on and talk about it. And it's interesting too to think about, like, yes, they've become more common, but again, with the different schools you go to, executive versus non-executive MBAs and stuff like that, really differentiating yourself.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see a more specialized market in the future, for sure. Like, the idea of just business as a single field of study will probably fade a bit, and there's going to be more of there's going to be finance-focused MBAs, technology-focused MBAs. You already see that a bit. The schools tend to have a certain kind of branding associated with them. For instance, Stanford is a lot more of a technology focus, and Columbia, which is one of the 2 schools I went to, has more of a finance focus. But I think that's going to become more prevalent. But listen, it's a great thing to do, but you got to take advantage of it in terms of being 100% there.
Yeah,
I think that's the lesson in life: is don't just show up. Right, you got to show up and contribute so much, and that's really going to make the difference.
Well, defining how you self-brand yourself too, I think, is an important part.
Yep. And I think there are people there who want to know you. They may not even know that they want to know you,
right.
But they do want to know someone like you. And if you're not making them aware of what you are and what you're like, and I mean, someone like you obviously has a great chance at self-branding, because you run a podcast, you're very introspective in the way you think about your life and the decisions you make. I think those are the important kinds of social skills you would need to get the most out of one of these programs.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has different reasons for going. There are our program is very global, so people came from a lot of different countries, and there are some countries where the people going, because they worked in government jobs, the network aspect didn't really matter that much. They really just needed the certification, they needed the paper, and so they really could just go, attend the classes and not get much out of it. But I think the meat of the class was people who recognized that this is only going to matter as much as we put into it. And putting into it really means, treating this practically like a family.
Mm-hmm.
People you would go the extra mile for.
Mm-hmm. It just makes me think too, like just on a slight tangent, there was a game I play, Apex Legends, where you actually have to go and work as a team and find ways to get around a battle or get into a battle, that kind of thing. And I made a friend on there that because of our camaraderie in the game, if he wants to go somewhere, I will follow that person. Even if I don't agree what his decision is, I trust that person well enough that I will go into the trenches with that person. If he wants to go to a hot zone where it's probably too dangerous, he'll probably die right away, I'll still do it. I'm like, okay, I trust your judgment. And he'll probably do the same thing for me too. And it's that camaraderie I think you're kind of alluding to there.
Absolutely. And it is true, the older you get, it's harder to find opportunities to get those, right? You probably have some amount of that camaraderie just with people you happen to grow up in the same neighborhood with. Completely random chance, costs $0, and yet you have a camaraderie with them. Another thing that's relatively cheap, at least from a money perspective, is joining the military, right? And once again, anyone who's been in a unit, especially if they've been deployed, super amount of camaraderie, right?
Yeah.
And I noticed, undergrad is similar for a lot of people. I certainly had that in undergrad, but as I get older, I get less and less opportunities to do this. And so this was, in another way, it wasn't the last opportunity because I'm seeking those opportunities constantly. I'm trying to, build those kind of long-term relationships with people, but there are smaller and smaller ways to do it, right? Masterminds are another example, right, where people are trying to create, some kind of business and project accountability with one another. But I thought, when else in my life am I going to have the chance to become pretty close with 50 people from all around the world and just, have like a real, quite intimate relationship with them?
Yeah.
I just don't know if I'll ever get that chance again.
Well, and that's the one thing, again, you kind of alluded to earlier with that loose network kind of mentality as well. Like, all these different connections. And speaking of a small little connection here, only a couple more questions before we end up wrapping up. One thing I wanted to talk about is that you helped out on Filmbot, which is like an interesting all-in-one social movie going experience. And I thought that was an interesting project you had on your profile. And I have to say it was really well done. Like, I looked at it. And what sort of experiences do you think helped accomplish that quality project, especially since you had to work with people?
Wow, you delved in deep there. That's an old one. So that was an interesting thing where I met. So I was there are lessons learned obviously too. But I met a guy who turned out to be the cousin of a good friend of mine from high school. It's just one of those completely serendipitous things where we started talking, and he said, "Wait, where are you from?" And he said, "My cousin goes to school there." And I said, "Yeah, that's a good friend of mine." And so we hit it off and had good personalities that I think just interacted well with each other. So we started really just bootstrapping the project Filmbot, which became a different project later. It became a kiosk app for movie theaters called Popcorn. I actually like the name Filmbot better, and I don't mind saying that in public because I told Max, the creator of Popcorn, that. But we were pretty much just doing basement hacking and trying to build it out. I will say one thing I've learned since then, I was still relatively young at the time. I think I was 24, 25. But I was not as directed in what I wanted to do with the product release. A lot of it was building for the sake of building. And it was great. I learned a lot. I got a lot more comfortable with the tools and tech we were using. And then, definitely bolstered my resume in some great ways. But ultimately, I don't think we ever got the platform to the level of stability that we needed to have. And so the learning there was, just kind of know the end before you start, right? And figure out what your product development goals are going to be.
Well, that kind of leads into a little bit of project management too, and just collaboration and learning like whose role is which and that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you have to have values alignment, right? Which is another big thing when you're working on projects with people. So just say, what are we trying to do? Is speed the value here? Is design and aesthetic quality the value? Is superior customer service the value? Right? What's the actual X factor for us? And that's something that my current partner Nicholas and I have worked a lot on is making sure we're very specific about the criteria for success, so that when we are making a compromise, we know what kind of compromise we're making.
When you mentioned how you guys kind of work on each venture as well, like how you kind of split it up, and you're trying to just go for your maximum strengths too, and what you're interested in as well, and that way you're actually putting a lot more effort in. So if you're working on something you're not as interested in, you're going to have a harder time really pushing yourself.
It's interest, it's skill set, it's also strategic, right? There are days when what he is doing is more interesting to both of us.
Yeah.
There's probably days where what I'm doing is more interesting to both of us. It varies a bit. The point being, though, that we're, to the extent that you're making a sacrifice on your interest level, you should be making it with the greater good in mind. Mm-hmm. And that's something we've really tried to bring into this business is let's try and be very strategic about what we're doing. And then this is just a big belief I have when working with people. And I do enjoy working with partners. It just makes it a lot more enjoyable for me. But I really want to trust people. I have to be able to trust them. And I show that by really doing it and saying, hey, there's an important meeting coming up this afternoon. Do you want to be in it? No, that's fine. What you say is as good as my word, right? And trying to develop that kind of trust in the organization is big with me.
Yeah, I love that. And the organizational structure as well, just making sure that everybody feels welcome in a way. I feel like. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. So one of the last questions I have here is that your business is a unique niche, going after businesses that are tech enabled but don't necessarily have the budget for a full fledged team. What does your company do then to help them achieve their goals?
Sure. Well, we work with them. We try not to communicate with them as if they know everything about software development, but we do appreciate the fact that they know everything about their customers, right? So the auto insurance industry is the one I keep going back to, but it's a long-standing client of ours, so it's been a good example of it. And they know everything about auto insurance and auto insurance law, and so I don't want to presume that they've got the wrong idea in mind when they're coming up with a requirement on that side. But then they also really want to look to us for expertise in different aspects. We had an issue recently where one part of the system would fall down, right, and then the whole system would go down. And this is because we now run 5 different platforms, and they're all communicating with 5 to 7 different APIs on the back end, right? So that means, I guess you do the math. There's just 35 points of failure, right? And so we had built ourselves into a level of complexity that we hadn't designed around yet, which is fine too. You shouldn't overbuild it up front, obviously. But we've been talking recently about what are the kind of resiliency plans we can put into place, and that's where our expertise comes in, and we're able to say, well, here's the resiliency we can do, and give them a menu of options. It's great because a lot of times in larger company environments or where tech is the product, I find product and engineering to be at each other's throats a little bit, where there's a little bit of animosity there sometimes, and maybe that could just be bad incentives in the organizations as well. With us, there's none of that. The idea is that there is an expert on this side of the line who's giving you all the technical advice you need, and then there's an expert over here who knows everything about the industry, and never should the two really fight about much. To the extent we'll fight about things, it's just occasionally what an estimate actually entailed versus what they thought it entailed.
Right. Well, and it's just interesting too, just again with that unity and cross-disciplinary knowledge coming together in unique ways. And even if you're not that one person with the 2 different areas of knowledge, 2 people coming together is still just as good, and having that ability to synergize.
It's powerful. It's one of the most fun things I get to do because I get to see people who know a ton about businesses that I never really spent a lot of time thinking about before.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great interview. And so, Trevor, where can people find you online?
Well, probably the easiest thing to do, because it'll just go to my link tree, which gives you everything else, is trevorewen.com. So if you go to that, it'll just give you the Southport Technology Group site, as well as Southport Ventures, and also my LinkedIn and Twitter. That's pretty much my online presence. Southport Technology Group is stg.software. That's the site. And then Southport Ventures is just southportventures.com. But yeah, if people want to hit me up, LinkedIn is good for messages. Twitter's fine too if you want to tweet. Certainly tweet out the episode. I will be as well.
Yeah. Well, and whenever people look for descriptions, I have tons of links in the description, probably more than what you even just said there. So all of your online presence. But one of those things too is what could be a call to action for the audience today? I guess check in the LinkedIn link tree,
Yeah, I think that would be good. I think one thing to think about is I'll just say the naked plug for Southport Ventures. The biggest thing we do there is we want to talk to business owners that are thinking about selling. And you may not be one. A lot of your listeners may not be one. They may be very motivated, but they may know one. So we're looking at niche vertical software products, usually SaaS, a lot of times API-focused businesses. And if you know someone like that, then we'd love you to use some super connection skills to help us out. And, for a lot of these kind of projects get accomplished through networks. And what's really cool about it is it's always like a win-win transaction, right? Because the kind of seller we're buying off of is not someone who's just, saddened or stressed out and is in a distressed state with the business. What we want is someone who actually wants to move on for some reason of their own volition, right? So they built up a good business. They've got a good thing going on, but they're ready to go travel around Asia or do something else for a few years. And that's the ideal seller. So some of your listeners may know people like that, and that would be the absolute best thing you could do. Any kind of introductions there are super helpful.
Awesome. And that's a great call to action. What do you think could be a good call to growth then?
I think the Cal Newport book I mentioned is actually worth reading for a lot of people who maybe spend a lot of time on screens these days and are trying to figure it out. Digital Minimalism is a really good book to check out. I would also say take a look at what you're doing in terms of online courses. You and I talked about that. There's some amazing, amazing stuff out there right now. And, I took a little time off from my MBA during COVID because a lot of the classes had gotten messed up and had gone fully virtual for a few months. And what I just decided to do was augment with some virtual classes out of other universities, and it was just super awesome. So that's just one of the best growth things you can do is realize how much great, if not free, practically free. I mean, we're talking on the order of $50 a month or something, information there is out there. And it's a shame to let it go to waste.
Really is. And so, once again, this is Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and Trevor Ewen on the Polymath podcast. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Dustin.
That was great.
Cool. I'm glad you liked it.